So today we are going to be talking a little bit more about some of the things that we talked about in the past week in lecture. So in lecture yesterday, or the day before yesterday, we started to make some connections between thinking and attitude and how that affects critical thinking. And as we discussed in lecture, we defined critical thinking as thinking that increases your chances of reaching your desired outcome. And we also discussed the two acronyms for thinking. We discussed thinking that is clear, critical, purpose driven, goal directed, and logical. And then, as far as attitudes associated with a critical thinker, we talked about planned thinking, self correcting, thinking flexibly, being persistent, thinking in an attentive way, and also being consensus seeking. And so, with these connections between thinking and attitude, we discussed how making efforts to have clear, critical, purpose driven, goal directed, and logical thinking can help us begin to maintain those attitudes associated with a critical thinker. So, we discussed goal directed thinking in lecture. So, critical thinkers will keep broad goals in mind, such as the goal to broaden our knowledge base, and also to avoid logical fallacies and inherent biases. So, with that, if biases are inherent, how should a critical thinker? We can't really completely eliminate biases. So, how should we work to realistically attempt to reduce or manage bias in critical thinking?
I agree that biases are inherently human. They are in our thinking. That's why you're taking this class, right? To learn to avoid these biases. So, the way we can do it is, first of all, it doesn't come naturally to us to avoid fallacies. So, we need to learn to and also develop those attitudes which eventually will help us learn not only just know these fallacies, but learn and use these fallacies in a way that then become second nature to us. So, to do that, first we need to learn what these biases are and understand these biases, understand the thinking processes behind these biases, then understand what goes wrong in these biases. That's why the psychology of critical thinking class that you're in now addresses these things differently, where we also talk about the research on what kind of strategies have shown to be helpful to help us get over those biases. So, so it's difficult, but through this class, what we're trying to do is learn, not just understand and know what the fallacies are, but to actually know the psychology behind it by understanding it in the context of thinking. Second, I would say when you're aware of it, remember in the definition of critical thinking, you use the word critical, and which actually means reflecting on your own processes, thinking processes, and reflecting on your own outcomes of the thinking processes, and reflecting on both the positive and negative aspect of it. So the very definition of critical thinking incorporates this very idea of thinking that is critical, meaning reflective. So when you start using these strategies or these aspects of critical thinking, then you become more aware of biases and eventually you get good at avoiding them. But
Makes
it's not
sense.
like a one time process, it's a continuous process of growth. I hope I answered that question.
Yes, you did. You did. So you said that keeping in mind that critical component of thinking is essential to be aware of bias in your thinking and being able to reduce and manage that bias in the long run.
Right. To be aware of both what is good and bad in your thinking, and this is biases are one aspect of what is bad in your thinking. It's hard, yes, but at the same time, the very nature of critical thinking incorporates avoiding those in the first place. So we are taking the first step to avoid.
Makes sense. And
Okay.
then another question I have about broadening your knowledge base, as we discussed earlier, keeping an open mind stance when broadening your knowledge base can support a consensus seeking attitude. That's one of the attitudes that we discussed is associated with critical thinkers. So, does consensus seeking generally strengthen decision making or can it sometimes weaken it?
Wow. So consensus seeking as one attitude that we discuss required for a critical thinker doesn't mean thinking to compromise. That's not the idea here. When you say decision making and you're saying that decision making in consensus may be antagonistic, you're saying that one may not support the other. If you can repeat the question. Good
Right.
question though.
So what I thought in this, in making this question is that generally, I guess in my opinion, I personally feel like the attitude of consensus seeking is
Hmm.
more so about keeping an open mind and listening to both or multiple perspectives instead of being focused on your own perspective and your own beliefs, which I totally agree with. But in a way, I also feel like it inherently forces you to be open minded enough that you maybe are not able to be firm in your own beliefs or your own decisions. It's kind of a give and take, but I personally, I feel like consensus seeking may weaken decision making in that sense, but in your opinion, can it also strengthen decision making or can it just only weaken decision making?
Okay, very good point. I see your question now. Okay. I see. First of all, let's define decision making. One way to think about decision making is to think of decision making as solving a problem, finding a solution to a problem where the solution you're finding is in the form of choosing one or the other. That's why it's decision making. You're making a
Right.
decision, the options, but you're trying to make sure that the decision you're making is a good decision, right? So that's decision making. Now, when you make a decision, one thing I want you to be aware of is there is no one way of getting to the solution, or there is no solution that is the only solution. It's possible that sometimes you get multiple solutions. That's why we have divergent thinking, where
Mhm.
you try as many solutions as possible. Another way to think about it is to find the best of all the possible solutions, right? So
Right.
if you think of decision making in that sense, what a critical thinker with consensus seeking does is giving the permission to think about as many potential solutions as possible, then try to find that solution set, not necessarily one, that would align with the beliefs of the individuals who are involved in this decision. So you're going beyond just finding the solution,
Mhm.
um, and you're not compromising here because you know that all these are possible solutions.
Mhm.
It's just that you are taking into account the purpose of the situation in which you're making this decision in the first place. If we
Okay.
are in a
Yeah.
group, we are making a decision, right? And the purpose of the decision that we are making as a committee, let's say, we're making a decision about what kind of assessment should we incorporate in our curriculum. You may have different opinions about it. I may have different opinions about it, but we both are trying to solve the same problem. Now, if we
Mhm.
both get back to this common ground and we can derive multiple solutions that
Mhm.
fall in our own belief systems, that would be solutions. So consensus seekers allows you to increase your problem space
Mhm.
to find a solution in a logical way, at the same time keeping the parties that have stakes in this decision making to agree.
Mhm.
So the consensus seeking is about that idea of considering multiple possibilities. Have I addressed your question? That's a really
I think
interesting.
so. I think that that is a way to strengthen decision making when you're able to consider multiple perspectives, not just your own. So
Yes.
I personally agree that like consensus seeking doesn't necessarily just weaken.
In fact, it might actually strengthen your decision making, meaning that it will give you opportunities to think about multiple ways of finding a solution,
Mhm.
right? And in creative
Mhm.
thinking, try to find multiple solutions, but you try to find a solution that is unique, a solution that hasn't been found yet. In that sense, consensus seek is a kind of facilitating that creative thinking aspects of.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah, that makes sense, that makes sense. And, that kind of leads to my next question. So people may tend to gravitate towards seeking certainty instead of seeking knowledge when in these kind of arguments or debates. And
mm,
so obviously these are two different goals in thinking that can conflict with each other. So how would you say having these two different goals can shape the process of thinking and also the product of thinking?
mm. Can you elaborate on this? Like when you say certainty, what do you mean?
So I personally think that seeking certainty and seeking knowledge are kind of two different goals you have in thinking. In seeking certainty, I feel like the person is more concerned with rather than seeking knowledge or wanting to know more, they are kind of seeking a solution to their problem or they're seeking a way to clarify something rather or to confirm their belief rather than to seek knowledge. So
Okay.
how
So
would these two different goals in thinking shape their thinking process and the product of thinking?
okay. So certainty here, what you are suggesting is where you're trying to resolve an issue or a situation so that your resolution doesn't conflict with your view of the world, so that it still makes sense, right? So you can see right away the outcome, the purpose in certainty seeking thinking
Hmm.
is to protect your beliefs,
Right.
right? So the product immediately changes when that is your aim. And that's what happens when people have strong opinions about topics. When they hear views or counter arguments or evidence against their views, automatically it evokes emotions and attitudes, and they don't even process the information that is given to you. So at a milder form, I think that's what you're referring to when you said
Hmm.
seeking certainty. So if your outcome is different, then the thinking processes also change. The thinking processes could still be logical, but constrained within the framework of your problem space to get only two such solutions that fit with your original identity or belief.
Information bias involved.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Now, when we talk about the knowledge seeking, right? I see more as, in the context of the question you asked, as truth seeking. Then your purpose is to find the solution, meaning to know the answer, to know the truth. But here is a point. You don't stick with the truth there, right? That's how science progresses. You're open to more information and ready to revise it because you're not worried about protecting your belief here. You just want to know the truth.
Okay.
Even scientists can have stronger beliefs about the findings of the science. Does it make sense?
Mhm.
So, a true scientific method should leave your certainty in suspension, truly
Okay.
speaking. But that's not what happens most of the time, right? So, critical thinking should seek further truth and hold on to the truth that you have, not as unchanged, but as what I know so far. This is most probably true, but when evidence changes, then your truth changes, your knowledge changes.
Okay. So you're saying that as someone that is truth seeking or seeking more knowledge, you should be open-minded enough to change your beliefs if evidence is presented that changes your beliefs rather than holding on to them.
Yes, yes,
Okay.
and it's difficult.
Yes.
This brings us the constructs that we discussed in class, in cognitive class, about your schemas, right?
Mm.
Being a critical thinker is to break those constraints and be open to different points of view.
Right. So it is possible to have strong beliefs but still be a critical thinker and seek further knowledge. It's possible to have both at the same time. You just have to be able to suspend your beliefs or like kind of put
Yes,
them on hold and be able to hear other perspectives without imposing your beliefs on other people or pushing
yourself.
off others' beliefs because you have your own really strong belief.
Yes, or pushing yourself to holding on to those as unchanged facts, but as possibilities. That's when I can listen to somebody else who is not me talk about anything and say, okay, now this is interesting. I want to know more about how you got there, as opposed to that is completely against my belief. So you must be.
And that kind of reminds me of something you mentioned in lecture about how if you align yourself with your belief in such a way that your belief becomes almost like your identity, it's really hard for you to, I guess, put aside your beliefs and hear other people or let go of your beliefs for new evidence that can change your belief. If you're so rooted in that belief, then it's more difficult to detach from that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And here, when I say that there are some core beliefs, it's human nature to form labels, as we discussed, right? To form categories and concepts. But some beliefs are so deeply ingrained that you start identifying yourself with those beliefs. Like, I'm a professor, that could be a belief, right? And I try to maintain that. And oh, professors don't do this, professors do this. If I try to maintain that as opposed to paying attention to my job, what happens is whatever I do would be dictated by what a professor should do or what would
Right.
be considered as someone who's a professor is doing. What
Yeah.
dictates your identity. The question is why? Why should that happen? Well, that happens if I can't see myself beyond that label, professor. I define myself as this label, and if I behave in a way that it shatters this, then I don't exist because I am equal to my label.
Hmm.
But if I am more than my label, if I am much bigger than this one label called professor, then even if I don't act like professor all the time, I still exist. So in conversations about how I behave, my focus is to protect myself, meaning to protect my label as opposed to listen to other possibilities.
When you say it still exist or not, I can't exist without this label, what exactly do you mean by that?
So if I believe in X, instead of meaning for now, I believe in X, if you make it so strong that I'm a kind of person who believes in X. Let's say there is evidence that there is no X. Okay, so what kind of person are you? Because there is no X. Are you a kind of person that believes in something that doesn't exist? Versus I lean towards X.
Hmm.
I think I believe in X.
Hmm.
If the evidence says there is no X, I can still say I have more information now to refine my belief that it's not X, it's actually
Makes
X
sense.
prime. Make sense? So you're not defining yourself based on the label, but you are holding on to that label as you're leaning towards that possibility. But you are not constraining yourself to one or the other um, label.
Okay, makes sense.
Any,
Okay, yeah, yeah, that makes sense, that makes sense. And so, we talked a lot about truth seeking in that last question, and so, I kind of wanted to turn that in a different direction. So we like we discussed in lecture, we talked about the importance of having a knowist perspective, and that's kind of what we've just been talking about. And more recently, we discussed, logical thinking. That's one of the parts of the acronym, that we discussed in class. So how is logical thinking different from truth seeking or knowledge seeking? And why does that difference matter for critical thinking?
Mm. Well, on the one side, you can argue that philosophers have come up with, and I'm not a philosopher, and I would like to apologize if he is not correct. But I would like to think in philosophy, or clear thinking is about seeking truth. It's about finding the truth. And philosophers have established clear, logical ways of getting to the truth. So, in that sense, they are not unrelated. That's one way of
Hmm.
looking at it. Logical methods are a um, means to get to the truth. And the scientific method adds a layer, systematic observation to that logical thinking and developed a method that involves not just one or the other, but both in a systematic way that you can come to more probabilistically closer to truth than you would if you just observe or if you just use logic. So that's why we have a scientific method. Now, coming to the way we used in class, the word noist and logic are in different ways. We use logic as a methodology, the standard we set for our thinking. So that's why it's under the thinking acronym. We said thinking that is logical, meaning that it follows the rules of reasoning
Hmm.
set by philosophy. Now, noist is more like a stance, like why. You might be thinking logically, but for different purposes.
Right.
If you're thinking it for the purpose of knowing the truth, I call that the noist stance. So it brings us to the very first question you asked about certainty versus
Knowledge seeking.
knowledge seeking or truth seeking. When you're certainty focused, your noist stance doesn't exist. You
Right.
want to get to a specific kind of solution there. With the noise stance, you're trying to get to the truth. In both instances, you can use logic, but the noise stance makes it more open and get to the truth with an idea that there could be other possibilities.
So would you say logic is kind of in this way, logic is like a tool um in the path of like truth seeking? So while you were seeking truth, you can use logic to build your thinking.
I think you can say that it's a tool, or you can say it's the best known standard that people have figured. That's why we incorporated that into scientific methods. That's the best we could think of.
Okay. Yeah.
to get to the truth. The only thing we have now is to use logic in systematic observation,
Hmm.
empirical, to get to the truth. There could be even better ones, but we don't know those things yet. Maybe
Hmm.
in the technology, we may come up with new ways of getting the truth,
Okay. Makes sense.
whereas
Yeah.
is the reason for using that tool.
Okay. And then another question I have, we talked a little bit earlier about biases. And so in this context, can logic eliminate biases? And we talked about how biases are inherent, so they can't completely eliminate them, but can logic reduce or manage biases, or can someone use logical thinking but still be biased?
We hope that by using logic over time you'll overcome biases, but that's not mandatory. You can still be learning to use logic for your personal gains and don't worry about getting to the truth. Make sense?
Yeah,
That itself, one may argue, is not logical because you're not getting to the truth. No, that again depends on how you want to define logic. If you purely focus logic on the strategies used, right, you can pretty much try to hide your biases or avoid most of the biases and come to a solution that is good for you, right? That may look logical, but again, it all depends. Can you consider that itself could be a bias given the fact that you're
right.
not taking into account the other perspective? Does it make sense?
Yeah,
If you don't take that reflective part of multiple perspectives, then it is logical. Because remember, logic, if you think about deductive reasoning, for instance, right? Your That's about how sound your process of reasoning is. Doesn't change the It is as good as the assumptions are, right? If your assumptions are bad, your logical conclusion or the logical process could be sound, but that's not a good argument necessarily
right.
because premises are not true. So
Hmm.
logic only gives us a reliable method to get to the truth.
Hmm.
But what is starting from the premises, if they are not true, then that could be that could result in what do you say, logical but not necessarily correct answer.
Guess that somewhat answers the question. So the question was like whether someone can use logical thinking but still be biased. So in that sense, you would say that like you can still use logic, but if you had this biased premise, then your reasoning, your logical thinking may be, your logic may be sound, but the
Absolutely.
outcome of your thinking may not necessarily be sound. It may still be biased.
Absolutely. And also you can also think in another way. When you use logic and observation, use scientific methods, the conclusions you draw have to be carefully stated. In general terms, Bertrand Russell, I think, said all knowledge is probabilistic. That's why you learn about confidence levels and hypothesis testing methods, and we'll do that more in this class. But when you get to the truth, you don't say that this is the truth. You provide the conclusions under some careful statements to say where it fits, when it fits, what can counter this. That's why we are
Hmm.
open to new ways of finding solutions to the problem. But if you don't take all this into account and just say research found this is the truth, then that's a fallacy in itself.
Hmm.
So the question is, you might still be using the right methods, but the conclusions you're drawing are too strong.
Okay.
Then that itself, you can argue, is logically wrong, but you can also argue that that's logically correct, but you're stretching it too much.
Yeah, makes sense, makes sense. But you're saying that, like, even though you're using logic, that, premise itself is, like, are you saying that, if the premise is just solely based on that logic, even though it may not necessarily be true, in that sense, it's a fallacy?
Yes,
Okay,
yes, absolutely. And, that's why when we talk about informal arguments, we'll talk about qualifiers, counters, and warrants.
makes sense.
Okay.
Okay, and so that brings us to our final few questions. So naturally, any person will have emotions in an argument or debate, and that's something that I thought was really interesting, like thinking about how emotions can potentially influence thinking.
Mhm.
So, in the role of emotion, and logic in thinking. Should critical thinkers just push off or ignore their emotions when they're thinking, or should they try to utilize them in the thinking process? Or is there some sort of in between that's that happy medium?
Interesting question. So, for now, in this context, I would like to think of emotions as immediate responses and attitudes towards a topic. In argumentation research, it is established that when you read an argument, a claim, it automatically activates your attitudes, meaning the
Right.
emotional response related to the topic. Now, this information is related to your beliefs, and this results in immediate activation of counter arguments to the claims you're reading if it doesn't match your belief. Okay, let's say you believe in and somebody said should be avoided, instead of processing the reason they'll present next, you have already activated the counter argument towards it.
Due to
So they hijack your thinking system. Another way to look at it is we have two systems. Remember, system one is a more automatic, quick system, and system two is a slow, gradual, intentional system. In cognitive psychology, we talked about conscious processes versus automatic processes, right? Emotions are like system one responses. And if you don't take a pause and continue to operate in system one, you will not evaluate information, not even consider the reason provided. You're just trying to defend your
Mhm.
view by providing counter arguments. On the other hand, if you take a pause and get into system two, which is difficult, system two is more conscious, deliberate, intentional, slow, then you're saying, I know my emotions are activated, but let me first listen to what they're saying. You're activating a system two. The moment you activate a system two, you're giving some room to take into account the critical thinking things we talked about, critical, clear, all those things. When you pause, you get some time to bring in your thinking skills required to
Mhm.
be critical. So in that sense, emotions can hijack
Okay.
your critical thinking, but emotions can also help you if you know how to use. That's why we use the word emotional intelligence, meaning if you are emotional, but if you're aware of your emotions and if you're aware of others' emotions, you are also aware of how to regulate your emotions. Then, based on your evaluations of others' emotions, you are using different thinking
Right.
strategies with the proper intention of finding the truth. Okay. Then it actually helps you as a critical thinker because now you can think these as more data points you have now to work with.
Right, right, right. That makes sense. That kind of answers a little bit that kind of answers my second question, which was whether, emotions when do emotions, support your ability to think clearly, and when do they interfere with your clear, logical, goal-directed thinking? So I guess that, in a sense, kind of answers that question too.
Yeah, yeah. Again, it's do you let emotions hijack your system too? If you do, then they take over the logical thinking jobs. But if you take a
Mhm,
pause, you can use those emotions to help you maneuver through the logical critical thinking process and help
mhm.
you get to the truth.
Makes
Um,
sense, makes sense. And then I guess my final question. So we discussed metacognition and we defined that as thinking about our own thinking process. So being reflective of our own thinking process.
mhm, mhm.
And so what happens to metacognition when we are very emotionally charged or stressed when we are thinking?
So when we're emotionally charged, your system two is hijacked, meaning you're
Mhm.
not pausing there, right? Your system one kicks in, which is automatic.
Right. So how does your metacognition how is it affected when you are emotionally charged or stressed while you are trying to think critically?
So when you're emotionally charged, because your system two is hijacked, you cannot think critically. For critical thinking, you want your system to be metacognitively aware. Like all these things we talked about, reflective thinking, reflecting on both the thinking processes and also the product. What else did we say? Uh, Thinking for purpose and keeping the goal of trying to avoid fallacies. All these things would be hijacked um, if emotions take over your thinking process.
So you're saying to take a pause and be able to kind of push your emotions off a little bit so that they don't take over your logical
Yes.
thinking.
And metacognition is being aware of all this, thinking about your own thinking. These properties of critical thinking attitudes are to develop these metacognitive skills. So, yes.
Yeah, so that's basically it for the questions that I had. We discussed kind of the connections between thinking and attitude and how those affect critical thinking as a whole. We talked about biases and how logic and emotion can affect those. And we also talked about truth seeking and how that's involved with logic and certainty seeking as well. So I think that was a very good way to kind of consolidate some of the topics we discussed in the past week in lecture.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Donna. I really appreciate it. And this is the first podcast for the critical thinking class. And thank you for volunteering to start this
Yeah,
podcast.
no problem.
And we seek feedback from our classmates and see if they like it, if they have suggestions. Also invite them to join and build from there. What I liked about this is that you took charge of learning, right? And that's the beautiful part. When students take charge of learning, they automatically be aware of their own understanding. Like, what have I understood, what I have not understood, and trying to fill those gaps themselves. As a teacher, there's only so much, but when student joins the conversation, real learning happens. I hope it did for you, and I hope
Yes,
other
definitely.
podcasts also get that experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you.